welcome Amy Edmondson, one of my dearest friends and esteemed colleagues, for a conversation which I think is very timely. In fact, I can't think of very many people I'd rather talk to more than you on the topic of psychological safety. Amy has a fantastic book, which is here, and you can see I've got it all marked up and because there's some really great and really practical advice in there, which hopefully we'll get to in the course of the conversation. But before we start, I thought I would raise something that just happened in the last day or two, and it really resonates to this moment we're in right now. And there's a very well-known venture capitalist called Fred Wilson, who hosts a Funding Friday every week. And someone replied to him on Twitter, circling back today because I was hopeful to see something constructive today. But once again, Fred Wilson's post didn't even mention the word Black or George Floyd's name. With such a powerful platform, I truly expect more. Still hopeful, just less so. And Wilson replied, "You're right," and diverted funding into the George Floyd Memorial Fund. And I just thought, what an interesting example of someone who was able to hear a message and just not, without arguing about it or anything, just say, you know, you're right.
It's perfect.
Powerful, huh?
It's powerful. It's a powerful response, and especially so because it strikes me as rare.
Mm-hmm. That's why I called it out. I was like, right. What?
Yeah, that's why you noticed it, right? I mean, think how stunning it is that we as human beings, you know, living in the so-called VUCA world, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, that we struggle so much to say, I was wrong, you're right. You know, to even say you're right can be feel like an admission of something, rather than, and fundamentally what it is I'm a human being and I have blind spots, just like every other human being.
Exactly. And I think that's so important. So let's begin at the beginning. The whole kind of path to discovering the importance of psychological safety. And I love the way you describe it in the book as, you know, why are these high-performing teams producing more medical errors? Like, that's totally counterintuitive. So maybe take us back to that moment, maybe.
Well, that moment, I was an early stage PhD student at Harvard in the PhD program on organizational behavior. So this was what was called a second year project. It was a research project that one needs to do to, you know, sort of advance to the next level of the program. And I had the chance to study medication errors in teams in some different local hospitals. And I thought it was a great opportunity, primarily because I was really interested in learning, in organizational learning. And I'd always thought the idea of learning from mistakes was an important topic. And then
you and I share that.
Fraught in obvious ways. But the beauty of this study was it had independent trained medical investigators who would collect the error data. And all I had to do was deliver a team survey to people early in the study. So I had, you know, all these teams responding to the survey, saying, you know, reporting on attributes of their team, like, you know, the clarity of the goal, the quality of the interpersonal relationships, the quality of the leadership. And those factors tend to be pretty highly correlated with each other. And then meanwhile, over a 6-month period, the trained medical investigators were getting error data, primarily by visiting the teams and looking through charts and then asking people what and they were all promised confidentiality and so forth. And it was a big, you know, NIH funded study on error. It was in the early days of people getting interested in this phenomenon that, you know, there are errors in healthcare delivery and we need to understand them so we can make them better. So my naive hypothesis was, I still think it's true, by the way, but the better teams would make fewer mistakes because they'd be more alert and more open and more able to talk to each other and have thoughtful coordination moments and so forth. And the data, once I had their data and my data, put them into the program together, it turned out to have this rather paradoxical finding, which was the better teams, according to a well-validated team survey instrument, appeared to be having more errors, not fewer. And it's like, wait a minute, you know,
how can that be?
Right? No, that can't be right. I mean, and of course, that surprise forced me to think, which is always a good thing. And I suddenly, you know, not in an instant, but in a few hours, I suddenly thought, well, wait a minute. this is kind of obvious in retrospect, but maybe the better teens aren't making more mistakes. Maybe they're more willing and able to talk about them, which especially in a context where so much is at stake, like healthcare delivery, seemed like an important aspect of being a good teen. And you also have to recognize that there's huge potential for things to go wrong every day, merely because every patient is unique, and these are sort of high-end teaching hospitals where a lot of the patients are quite complex indeed. So, and 24/7 operations, lots of handoffs, lots of different experts and so forth. So there's good reason to imagine that things are going wrong, or at least not perfectly right all the time. And the best way to have good outcomes is to really be open and talk about what you see and what you're worried about and what you're not sure about, so that by the time the patient is touched, it's right? So that was that was my new hypothesis. Ultimately, I was able to get at least some pretty good suggestive data in that study that might be the case, and then had to sort of carry that idea forward in a more formal way in subsequent studies where I started to call it psychological safety.
That came much later. Yeah. So one of the things you talk about a lot in the book is this sort of little calculation all of us make all day long about the benefit to cost ratio.
Yeah.
And I think in this time in particular, that's such an important idea to have right at the top of our minds, which is, well, maybe just explain that idea and then why I think it's so critical right now.
Well, so I like to say there's a little, calculating machine in your head, below, most of the time below conscious awareness. Sometimes it rises to conscious awareness, but you're weighing the benefits of speaking up against the costs of speaking up. And the benefits of speaking up, let's put it this way. If I'm a nurse, working in a busy hospital on the night shift, and I'm not 100% sure that a particular dose is the right level, I might stop the physician in that moment and say, hold on, I think that's wrong. And if the benefit to me of that is that patient may or may not be helped by my voice, and that benefit may or may not show up for a while. But the benefit of not speaking up, of silence, if you will, is no one thinks that I'm stupid because I pointed out something that actually was wrong anyway. And so I stay safe. I stay protected, if you will. And that benefit to me is 100%. So, or put it in terms of cost, the cost to me is that you might yell at me, or you might think I'm stupid, or you might think I'm intrusive or negative or unhelpful. And so we make those little sort of calculations all the time. And as I said, it gets to be instinctive. We don't think about it very much. But much of the time, the voice that we want people to express benefits the collective and potentially puts themselves at risk, right? Or at least they feel it puts themselves at risk. So we're sort of, that little calculus ends up pushing us towards silence rather than voice. And that's a problem in a complex, uncertain world.
Right. And we're seeing it right now where, several years ago, there were people even then protesting, and they were kind of shunned, in terms of not being seen as sort of getting along or playing the game or disrespecting the flag or, whatever it was. And now we're almost seeing those protests as prescient.
Right. And in fact, it's interesting because the phenomenon I was talking about a moment ago is sort of very micro, very interpersonal, happening in the workplace. Do I say something? Do I ask for help? Those little calculations where, I'll figure it out. I'll Google it. You just kind of hold back, right? Whereas what you're just describing, and I think is so true, is that right now we're seeing a version of this phenomenon at the macro level, the societal level. And many people at great risk to themselves are getting out there to use their voice, to talk about injustice, pain, fear, and they're willing to go out there and do it. And there is potential harm to
Oh,
themselves. In fact, what far too many people are experiencing that harm.
mhm.
And that's a kind of a devastating thing that we as a society can't figure out how to not punish voice, but in fact encourage voice, because that's a democracy requires voice.
Exactly. Well, and you and I had a little exchange about some of the nurses in the hospitals in New York who were, having had no effective response from their sort of chain of command, as it were, went public with the lack of
Right,
protective equipment, with some of the conditions they were
right.
forced to work in. And the hospitals were trying to shut them down. I
Right,
mean,
and they got publicly rebuked, which is the worst possible thing.
absolutely.
Because the message you're basically sending then is to other people, right? To
Mhm.
other people, please
Oh,
don't
yeah.
do that. Do not
Yeah.
speak up with bad news. Do not speak up with problems. Do not speak up with a need for help.
Mhm. Well, and one of the things I think is very interesting, and we're seeing this playing out in several settings. So I'm thinking of the captain of the Roosevelt, or these nurses, or most
Yeah,
recently the New York Times reporters sort of saying we don't believe this particular article should have been written. And there are people who aren't being heard within the context of their system, so they're actually having to go outside the system to find that
that's
avenue
right.
for their voice.
And so we've been talking about speaking up, but the other side of speaking up is listening, and listening is both a vital thing to offer someone who is speaking, but it's also a way you learn yourself, right? I mean, when you're really listening, you gain, because you can't learn less, right? You can only get smarter and wiser when you're listening.
Mm, mm. And one of the things that I would observe is that, we've been talking a lot about leadership and how leadership needs to change. And you do mention that in the book. And one of the most interesting things that has sort of come up multiple times is that often women leaders do that better. They're just, whether it's conditioning or whatever it is, I don't know, but women leaders
Yeah.
tend to do more listening. I mean, not all, but
No,
sort of
no.
on balance, they tend to find it
Right.
easier. They tend to find it better. And it's very interesting, because in the book you go through a number of stereotypical strong leaders, right? Who actually had the effect of shutting down discourse and rejecting
But yeah,
constructive criticism.
I never until this moment thought about the not 100% obviously, but there is, I think, a majority of women leaders in the chapters on organizations that have worked hard to make it safe for voice. And I never made that connection before, which is pretty blind of me. But I have been noticing a lot, and of course there have been some very good pieces out there about the national leaders during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I think one article had something like, 11 out of the 13 countries that have done a pretty good job are led by women.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I mean, I'm loving, like, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Like,
Oh, and she's my hero, right?
she's amazing.
Only she weren't so darn young. I mean, wow, how do you get so wise at such a young
Yeah,
age? Terrific.
and it almost seems instinctive. So just back to the what are people afraid of? And you talk about looking ignorant, incompetent, or disruptive, right? And being the skunk at the picnic.
Yeah.
And I thought, kind of interestingly, how do we? Well, let me tie that to another thought, which is something you and I share, which is this notion of, in a high uncertainty situation, which is the whole VUCA thing, where
Right.
it's hard to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Strategy is really almost as much about rapidly testing hypotheses as it is about anything else. I mean, I still think you need a broad strategic direction. We need to know whether we're in petrochemicals or band-aids, but, but at the same time, you've got to make it safe for people to test hypotheses and be wrong about them.
Right, and that's where your book is so spot on. And I wrote a very short article year or so ago that strategy should be a hypothesis you continually test, right? And that's which is essentially a lot more about this than I do, but it's yes, right. And that suggests, a hypothesis suggests confidence enough to articulate something thoughtfully and put money and time behind it, while remaining ever vigilant to the data, right? What are the data telling us? so that we can use it to get even smarter, and to pivot as needed. And so uncertainty, with respect to psychological safety, is, has two big connections, or important connections. And one is the very existence of uncertainty is what means psychological safety is essential, right? Because if we had pure certainty, if we had a blueprint for success and a crystal ball for how things will work out, we actually don't need psychological safety. We just need you to do your work and get on with it.
Exactly.
Right. And so it's the very existence of uncertainty that gives rise to the need for people to speak up, because they're the ones who are going to be kind of bringing the data forward. And the second aspect is, in some ways, uncertainty is a gift for a leader to explain why he or she needs to hear from people, right? It's so it creates psychological safety. Not only creates the need for voice, it creates the rationale for it, right? So if I make explicit that we face enormous uncertainty, then the rational case for why I actually do want to hear from you, rather, it's not just a line, I actually do want to hear from you, makes a whole lot more sense. If I think I know everything and I act as if I think I know everything, and then I tell you, oh yeah, I'd love to hear from you, I don't think so.
Right. Well, there's this wonderful book, and it's titled something controversial, like Why So Many Incompetent Men.
Oh yes, I love that book. Yeah, so much. Yeah.
But this notion of confusing confidence with competence. Yeah. I mean, we're not very smart about this in many cases. And, in the book, you talk about, you can have a good process that leads to a great outcome. You can have a bad process that leads to a bad outcome. But what I try to beat people over the head with is, we are so subject to the halo effect, right? Where we judge the quality of what came before with the outcome. And certainly in the world of strategy, you can't do that. My office is piled knee deep with the case studies of Dell. When I first started at Columbia, you could not move for Dell case studies, or Nokia, or General Electric, and on and on. And I would say, sorry?
Let alone Enron.
Oh, absolutely. And on and on. But I think one of the things that really does characterize, in many cases, a lot of those stories are, and it gets to my work on inflection points, somebody always knew. Somebody always knew. And either they weren't in a position to communicate, they didn't feel they could communicate, they felt they would be punished if they were the skunk in the room. And so one of the things I talk about a lot is having executives get out to the edges of the organization. So talk to those people who you don't normally have in your orbit and get that information, because it is uncertain and we don't know. So back to this notion of hypothesis testing, and we share a mutual interest in failure and how it can be beneficial, even though it's really awkward.
Go figure.
Sorry?
Go figure. Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is, not all failure is useful, and not all failure should be tolerated. There are certain kinds of failures which we share a comment calling it intelligent failures, right? And one of the things I think that a lot of the executives I work with need to reframe is, if I have a hypothesis and it's going to cost me $500 to go test that hypothesis, whether the answer is yes or whether the answer is no, the question is not, was I right? The question is, was it worth $500 to figure out whether that was right or not, right? And I think it's a different way of looking at being wrong.
It's a very different way of looking at being wrong. And it suggests that before you're going to be wrong, which you are going to be, like it or not, at various times, before you venture in that direction, you've at least put some thought into it. And that's, of course, the nature of the hypothesis. You put thought into it. You've thought about how best to test it, what the likely outcomes could be, what the opportunity is. And it better be motivated by a reasonably strong opportunity, or don't waste the $500, right? There's got to be some potential upside.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the experience of writing the book like for you? Because I know it took you a while, and clearly, it covers like from the beginning of the concept all the way through your frequently asked questions, which I thought were really interesting.
Well, yeah, it took me a long time to do all the work and, to let it percolate. But the writing of the actual book didn't take all that long. It took a long time to sort of figure out how to write the book. But there was you know, the eureka moment, which was something like, you know, right before New Year's Eve, in, I guess, 2017, was when I suddenly realized how I could structure it, right? Because I had all these ideas,
Mhm.
and okay, that could be a chapter, and that could be a chapter, but then this idea would bleed into, and it didn't work. So I kept sort of massaging it, not getting anywhere. But the eureka moment was basically that there would be, you know, the beginning and the end, and then in the middle would be 4 chapters. And the first 2 would be essentially bad news chapters. I mean, where a whole chapter on remarkably large business failures that didn't have to happen. And as you just said, because at least one person, more often more than one.
Oh, many more than one in many cases. Right. I mean, you talk about the Volkswagen case.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, in the Volkswagen case, I always want to say, to a certain extent, my heart goes out to any engineer, you know, who finds it easier to, you know, or more palatable to come up with software to defeat, you know, to cheat the regulators than to tell his boss the truth, right? That's got to be a very painful place to be. So I have empathy for that. And then I want to look around and say, how do we make sure this never happens again, right? So the 4 chapters were, you know, a whole chapter on big business failures, headline failures like VW and Wells Fargo, and then a chapter on tragic human safety failures that didn't have to happen. And again, someone knew, and was somehow silenced by their own fear of the consequences in the hierarchy. Right. And then 2 chapters, thankfully. I have to admit, it's harder to find, but there you go. But 2 chapters on sort of wonderful business successes and wonderful human safety successes based on real effort to build psychological safety. And so then, you know, then it was just a matter of kind of sitting down and writing. And of course, the beginning tries to set the stage where why is this important, tells the story that we talked about earlier and some others, and then does a little bit of a, you know, translation of what the research literature says about this variable, this concept.
Yeah. I mean, it's very approachable. It's just, I'll just use my prop again for those of you who are just joining us.
Thank you.
Fearless Organization, really awesome book on this topic. So we've talked a little bit about teams, and I know you've got a long-standing interest in teams, and you have a great TED Talk on the concept of building teams. And I wonder if you could maybe expand on that a bit.
Sure. I mean, the one of my, maybe it's because I studied healthcare early on, but one of my relatively early insights about teams today is that they don't perfectly match the teams of yesterday, by which I mean, I was brought up in the teams literature to say a team is a stable, bounded group of individuals.
Totally. And they went through this 4-step process, right?
Right, they go through a 4-step process.
Forming, norming, and then performing.
And an end, or maybe some of them go on forever if you're just a particular, you know.
Well, I remember that literature.
Right. And the beauty, you know, the fundamental insights, which were very powerful and empirically robust, was that teams would perform well to the extent that the structures were right, you know, that they had the right people on the team, the right goal, the right access to resources and all of that. And yet in 24/7 healthcare operations, for example, with complex patients exhibiting a range of conditions that come in an unpredictable way, you didn't have stable teams. You couldn't. You know, it wasn't because they didn't want to or didn't recognize that might be a nice thing to have. It's that the work itself wouldn't let them. And for the 2 reasons. 1, the knowledge base was in flux, and 2, the 24/7 operations mean you're going to have to be doing handoffs and so forth. So I started thinking through this lens, like how do we help those kinds of teams do well? And using, you know, I use the term teaming, not to say this is a construct or a phenomenon, but to say this is a lens through which we need to look to better understand the factors that help people coordinate and collaborate effectively over time in these fluid arrangements.
I mean, some of the early work that really informed a lot of what I do. And sort of, it's funny, you know, you kind of started with teams and psychology and ended up at strategy, and I kind of started at strategy and ended up with bloody people. You know?
I know, the people are the
So,
hard part.
sorry?
People are the hard part.
Absolutely. So one of the original articles I remember was a fabulous paper about heedful interrelating on flight decks. Remember that one? Where basically talking about these incredibly dangerous environments that produced relatively few adverse consequences. Yeah. And what allowed that? It was this concept of really almost hyper teaming. And I think we're even more in that kind of space now. And then you add to it that we're all relating virtually to people we may never, ever meet in person. I mean, I think that adds a whole nother layer to it, because even with psychological safety, so much of our cues about what's the cost or what's the benefit come from being in a room with other people, you know, physically. And it's just much harder. And I would imagine there are a lot more mistakes being made in a virtual context.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. You know, the term reading the tea leaves, you know, it is a very, you know, visceral phenomenon that you're taking cues from all sorts of sources rather than just, you know, the little rectangle that we're all relating to each other through now.
Well, right. And I think also a lot of our mechanisms of communication, you know, as email came to take over from verbal communication and phone calls kind of went away, you know, it's so easy to misinterpret or to get it wrong or to actually say something you didn't intend whatsoever, and just to get all that stuff wrong. So one of the things that I often find with powerful concepts like psychological safety is, first of all, they get misinterpreted. And then a whole mythology builds up around what it is and what it isn't. Yes. So maybe for the record, just what is it not?
It is not being nice. And that's, that's the top of my list of what it's not. And I'll never forget, you know, Google did a big study a number of years ago, 2016 New York Times cover article about this.
I remember.
Magazine cover article.
I remember very pointedly pointing out to them that perhaps a little attribution to the—
Yes, you were terrific on that. You were terrific. And, you know, it was in that long article, Charles Duhigg, the author, the reporter, the author, did point out, you know, did use my name and did in the online version, you could link to the original academic paper, which I'm sure nobody did, and I don't blame them. But you're right, as it got picked up widely, given its visibility of the New York Times and Google, everybody started talking about it as, you know, as Google's idea of psychological safety. That didn't bother me, you know, because I was just so pleased it was out there. Yeah. Although it was always just gratifying when you or someone else set the record straight on the originator, but that's okay, right? That wasn't the, but what did bother me was that, you know, people would pick up this thread and write digital articles here, there, and everywhere. And, you know, and some of them were a little snide, like Google did all this work to figure out what allows high performing teams. And the answer is being nice. And I go, oh, you know, that's where I want to pull my hair out, because the funny thing is, and I understand it's partly my point, I mean, my fault, right? Because the term itself, you know, psychological safety, which I didn't coin, it was a term of art already, but it does have this soft and fuzzy feeling to it. But the essence of a psychologically safe workplace is one of candor, right? It's one where you're not holding back, trying to read the tea leaves. You're speaking up directly about work relevant content. And, you know, you referred to the skunk at the picnic phrase earlier. And that is really one of my favorites, because that is a story, and it's in the book briefly, but it's a story that came from a senior, you know, top management team of a large electronics company. And because I always like to point it out, this is not just sort of lower level people who are scared and so on, right? This is a, you know, an executive remaining silent when he had grave doubts about the wisdom of a planned takeover, because all of his colleagues were enthusiastic, seemed very enthusiastic. Of course, who knows, others of them weren't as well. And then he said, later when they were sort of debriefing the postmortem, if you will, he said, I really let you down. I had doubts and I didn't speak up. And then he said, I didn't want to be the skunk at the picnic. Now, it's a remarkable phrase because it's so evocative. You know, you sort of think, oh yeah, right, who wants to be a skunk at a picnic? But what I love about it is it reveals how often, you know, thoughtful, well-educated, well-intentioned people have what I would call the wrong frame. Right? Two things: a strategic decision meeting is not a picnic, right? That's the wrong frame. You know, it's a kind of a high level and highly consequential discussion, debate, what have you. That's what it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a picnic. And when you have a different point of view, you're not a skunk, you're a treasured team member, right? So I like to say, you know, if you can get the frame right, then you can get the conversation right. So it's not about being nice, because being nice is often, alas, interpreted as, oh, I'm going to support your idea even if I don't agree with it, or I'm not going to say what I really think to your face because that wouldn't be nice.
Or I have data that suggests what you're doing is kind of, you know, colorblind or whatever. You know.
Right. And we got to stop being nice. I'm not saying we should be mean or rude. I don't believe that at all. But we need to be willing to take interpersonal risks. I mean, like in the current situation, people are, I think, starting to recognize explicitly that it's really hard to take interpersonal risks. And yet today, in the present moment, it's worse not to take them than to take them. Right. So many,
kind of back to Fred Wilson's point about you're right.
You're right.
End of conversation. You're right.
And many people of color are saying the worst thing you can do is say nothing. Right. And that is saying, yeah, I mean, I know you won't get it right. That's okay, right? But it's not okay to say nothing. So we're all learning the hard way, in a way, that we need to take interpersonal risks.
And I think that's in this moment, it's all very fraught. You know, is kind of how I feel about it. It's hard to know what to do. So, you know, it's hard to know what part of yourself to bring. And you know, I've been trying in small ways to kind of figure out where one might land on some of these issues, but it's not easy.
No, it's very fraught. And in fact, in a funny way, the only, you know, the silver lining perhaps is that it has always been fraught, but we didn't know it, or we weren't talking about it, right? And maybe if a landscape is fraught with tripwires or what have you, it's a whole lot better. It's a step one if we're able to talk about its fraughtness.
One of the things that I find most interesting in the work that's done on, you know, diverse teams is how, you know, there was some fantastic work that my late colleague Kathy Phillips did. And the problem with real life, as we both know, is you never know what the right outcome is. Like you can never sort of take messy reality out of it and, okay, that was unambiguously the right outcome. But in a laboratory, you can. And one of the things she did was she had a creativity challenge, in which there was a right answer, right? And there were gradations of getting the right answer or not, and you could actually measure that in a lab setting. And so she took homogeneous teams and diverse teams and had them complete the same task. And what I found was absolutely fascinating was the homogeneous teams felt great about what they had done. So they got right into it. They communicated effortlessly. We understood each other. We all agreed on the goals, and we proceeded methodically. And it sounds like a really good story until you realize they vastly underperformed the diverse teams. So the diverse teams reported feeling awful. Oh my God, I didn't know where that person was coming from. We had to work so hard to even figure out what the challenge was. And apparently, sorry?
It wasn't as much fun.
It wasn't fun, no, not at all. But apparently what Kathy's work found was that this necessity of grappling with the fraughtness or the diversity activates a part of your brain that is actually very helpful in creative problem solving. Wow. And I thought that was super interesting because, you know, you can't judge how well you did by how good you feel about it. And it's fascinating. Um, one story, just to go back to senior executives not being afraid to speak up. One of my clients is a gentleman named Stefano Pessina, who's like a super billionaire, very successful business person, very straightforward. And I remember being in a meeting with him, and one of his direct reports was, I don't know, giving some kind of talk. And Stefano heard him out, and then he looked at him and he said, I knew that. And the guy said, yeah. And Stefano just said, well, then you just wasted 15 minutes of time. Now, what was interesting about it was, in another context, a remark like that would have been taken as an absolutely brutal shutdown.
Yeah.
In this case, it wasn't. He was just saying, look, you knew I knew that, right?
Right.
Sorry?
It was just factual.
It was just factual. And it was like, and it wasn't critical. It was more just kind of, let's make sure that we, if we're in that condition, let's not do that again, which is back to the notion of mistakes that teach you something versus mistakes that don't. So I thought that's kind of
right. Well, one of my favorite, or least favorite management sort of truisms, which I just think is absolutely problematic, is don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions, right? I mean, it's like, no,
I hate that.
Because you know what the real message is? Don't come to me with problems. It's intention. I get its intention. Its intention is to be, let's be solution oriented. Let's be creative. Let's, think outside the box. But you're really sending the message, I don't want to hear bad news. And it misunderstands the reality of a VUCA world where problem detection, we're very good at that as individuals, but problem solving is very often a team sport.
Yes.
Right? We're going to need to get diverse voices from different parts of the organization or the ecosystem or what have you to come together and figure that out. So it's like, bring me the problem, bring us the problem, and then offer any ideas you have. But really, it's like launch a process.
It's almost like a creative endeavor. Right. So one of our participants would like to know what does one do if one's senior leaders are kind of committed to whatever non-psychological safety is.
Right.
How do you take the way out of that?
Ruling by fear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give them the book. No. Here's my, I think my best answer to that question is focus on, we have a human tendency to look up. Right? To say, yeah, but they're not doing it. I can't change them. Maybe so. I mean, I'll say in a moment a couple of things I think you can do. But the most important thing you can do, first and foremost, is look across and down. Wherever you sit, there are people whose work-life experience, experience at work, you can help make better. You may not be able to change them, but I promise you, you can change you and you can change the experience of your colleagues. And
I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And what is it I'm suggesting you do? Well, for one, ask good questions, right? Ask thoughtful questions about work relevant material. And then, really important, listen, right? Listen intently. To the answer, show that you're listening, respond, get into it, right? Because every time you ask someone a genuine question about their project, about their ideas, you're giving them in that moment, like a tiny little stage, in which you're saying, I am interested in hearing what you have to say. Then you better do it, right? You better actually listen, and so I think if everybody, just where they sat, did their part. The other thing about psychological safety is it always, just like in that hospital study way back when, it's always variable inside a big organization, right? This is a really, and like the Google study, right? Here's a great team with lots of candor and lots of creativity, and over here, not so much. So you should really focus on where you are and make it happen there. And then the other part is some of the things that you can do wherever you are can apply upward. I mean, I'm not saying most people can't go several layers upward and go make a difference, but they can certainly create, as I said, a safer conversation space where they are. And you can always do a really powerful thing with your own manager as well, which is ask good questions. Just really seek their views and then ask ask them what they think of yours, right? So to like get the dialogue going, and as long as you have it in a kind of thoughtful, constructive way, it will be a mutually rewarding experience, and you're off and running.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, I think we mix up hierarchy with influence very often. That a lot of times in better run organizations anyway, what I would observe is leaders actually see those nuggets of insight as a gift. I mean, Alan Mulally, who's the former CEO of Ford, talks about this all the time. And he said, in a performance setting where you've got color coding, like green is good and yellow is like a few problems and red is like flashing warning lights. And he always says the reds are a gift. The reds are a gift. If I come into a situation and there's genuinely no problems and we're headed over a cliff, that's a much bigger problem.
That's scary. That's right. We're on track, as Mulally put it once, we're on track to lose $17 billion this year and nothing's going wrong. Wow, we're in trouble, right? But if you can tell me all the things that are going wrong, then we're no longer in trouble. Then we're on our
And he
way.
has the greatest phrase, which I think goes very nicely with this whole discussion, is you can't manage a secret.
Right. The data set you free.
Exactly. So one of the questions from our listeners is, so how do I, as an individual, get better at speaking up, get less fearful, get less, constrained by, and the other thing I would say that I've observed is a lot of times people completely overstate the amount of the negative that's going to happen to them. They mix up hierarchy, and a lot of, most senior leaders I know, and not all, but most, are pretty reasonable people.
Yeah.
Most of them aren't psychopaths. Some are, but most are not.
Most aren't. No.
And they're
intentioned.
And they're willing
right.
to hear. So one of the things, and I'll be interested in your perspective on this, one of the things I advise people to do is, find allies. Like, don't be a lone voice out there in the middle of nowhere. Find allies. Recruit people who look at things the way that you do, and they can, if it's one person who's a voice in the wilderness, that's one thing. But if it's a group of people who you respect, and I say this all the time in my exec ed classes, you were not sent to this incredibly expensive Columbia Business School program because your organization has no interest in what you think or want to say. So, don't let that be a barrier to you. When you go back, they're going to want to know what did you take away that's going to be of long-term benefit to our organization.
You bet. So there's a few important things in what you said, and underlying the question, what can I do? I think it's really important to emphasize what you said, which is that oftentimes people imagine the consequences to be worse than they are. Mm-hmm. And let me give you an example of that. Jim Dietert and I did a big study on sort of how people think about these moments where they hold back. And by the way, we interviewed hundreds of people, and not a single one couldn't think of a moment where they had held back on something, big or small, but something work relevant, and then we'd probe the stories and try to understand what was going on. And one of my favorite ones was a person in a manufacturing plant who said that he had an idea for how to improve the line, if you will, a small amount, but it would have been an improvement, and he didn't share it. And when we asked why, he said, well, I have kids in college. Like, huh? Like, say what? At first glance, a non sequitur, but of course we all intuitively know what he means, which is I can't afford to rock the boat. Like, I can't afford to lose this job. So we probed further and said, tell us about a time when someone lost their job because they spoke up, right? You got to be able to. We imagined there would be stories that kind of contribute to that fear and that reluctance. And without missing a beat, he said, oh, everybody knows we never fire anybody. And then it's like, huh? So like in a sort of rational way, he understood that his own fear was irrational.
That's fascinating.
It's like we don't challenge it enough. We sort of think it's like the little child part of us who wants to be accepted on the playground, right? So we just sort of, we're always erring on the side of, well, maybe that won't be appreciated by my boss, so I'll hold back. And of course, bosses in turn need to, say things like, hey, what do you got? I'm sure I haven't thought about something here. I bet there's a way to improve this line. Anyone have an idea, right? But so we imagine, we don't think about it. I had a boss once who said, you're in a car, you're late for an appointment, and you're starting to get really anxious, and it's like, almost ridiculously anxious. And why is it? Well, I might miss the appointment. Well, so what? Well, I might not get the job. Well, so what? And he goes through this whole chain, and at the end of the chain is, I might starve to death. In other words, we awfulize, right? So what? You're going to be late for the appointment, right? But we have the same kind of physiologic reaction as if, horrible things are going to happen. So most important thing in terms of helping yourself get better at speaking up is to realize the consequences that are making you anxious about speaking up are usually not of the magnitude you are unconsciously or subtly imagining them to be. And then that they're really not that bad. And in fact, more often than not, someone will appreciate your idea or your question or your concern rather than the other way around. The red is a gem. And then the other thing is, just because this is hard, and we've shown it to be hard, is just use the gradient approach, meaning start with small risks.
Yeah.
Just tiny, small bites. Speak up in a meeting that you wouldn't ordinarily speak up in, with a suggestion that is innocuous, and just practice, and you'll get that experience of the reward of people listening, and begin to develop that muscle a little bit.
And you talk about leadership helping us do the unnatural, which I think is a really interesting way of framing that, which is, and I go back to Alan Mullally, right? I mean, a remarkable leader came into a company with a poisonous corporate culture. I mean, just really, really bad. And got them actually working together and sharing ideas and creating that sense of safety and moving forward. And so I think it is important, to remember that it doesn't happen without effort, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't, we don't naturally do this, right?
Right. We naturally hold back. We're naturally interpersonally risk averse. We're naturally very sensitive to hierarchy. We have a deep and old, rooted concern that those above us have the potential to, shape our future.
Yeah. You can get kicked out of the castle, You can get kicked out of the castle.
Right. You can get kicked out of the castle. You can get kicked out of the tribe, and you don't want that because your very life, once upon a time, did depend on it. But in a, knowledge intensive world that's complex and uncertain, in fact, you should get kicked out of the tribe if you never do speak up, right? If you never have anything to offer, it ought to be flipped on its head.
Yeah, what are you?
But unnatural. Leadership is necessary. Like if in fact we all rose to the occasion and did the right things easily and naturally, you wouldn't need leadership. It would just happen. So we need leadership to kind of help us swim upstream against our psychological currents.
One of my favorite stories is, so to set the scene, so here's Microsoft, right? New CEO, fairly new CEO. And one of their groups, their research group, is trying to figure out the future of human-machine interaction. So how are we going to actually interact with these robots once they get smart enough to do that? And so they decided to run this experiment. They created a chatbot named Tay, an AI bot named Tay. Do you remember the Tay story? I think this was in 2016. Well, they made the mistake of launching poor Tay, who's this, sort of young female chatbot, and they launched her on Twitter. And like the worst of humanity, within about 24 hours, had this poor little chatbot spewing, racist epithets and neo-Nazi whatever, and it was just horrible. So they had to take her down like immediately. It made headlines. It was super embarrassing. I mean, it was just a really, kind of very visible, unfortunately, failure. And I'll never forget, Nadella wrote, the head of the team. He said, "Look, I agreed with your hypothesis. We need to understand something about human-machine interaction. This one didn't exactly go the way that we hoped, but don't worry, I've got your back." And I thought, wow. And if you think about it, nobody died. The consequences were not. It's a little embarrassing, okay, but people love to laugh at Microsoft. Why not? And it put a kind of a human face on the company, and
it's new territory. I mean, it's you're you're going to have failures in novel territory.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are not foreseeable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, of course, the very essence of an intelligent failure.
Well, right, right. And I talk about sometimes people can actually build a contract for intelligent failure, which is if we're embarking on this journey, let's agree between us. What are the conditions under which this was really kind of a stupid thing and we should have prevented it? Right. Versus, okay, this was my $500 well spent, you know?
Right, exactly. And one of the things in the former category would be if you said there was a guy right over there who did this already, or a guy right over there who could give you a great reason why scientifically this won't work, and you hadn't known that or bothered to find out.
Exactly. Yeah, I always say to people in the innovation area, like, you know, learn from the mistakes of others and then go make your own mistakes. There's no point remaking the mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Which is why really good performance, you know, we like to say people learn, you know, it's the good performers learn from their failures. Yes. And the really good performers not only learn from their failures, they tell everybody else in the company, right? So that you don't have to have the same failure a second time, because then it's not so intelligent anymore.
Yeah. There's a wonderful book called Hope is Not a Method, which is about the military's after-action review process. And one of the things they bake into that process is that last step, which is once we've sort of said what happened, what do we want to have happen, what actually happened, what will we do differently next time, and then we disseminate it. You know, and that happens at every rank in the military. And I think that's such an interesting practice. Imagine if you did that like in your own organization or in your own life. So I know people will be hungry for, call them tools or frameworks. You've got a ton of them in your book, which I think is awesome. Are there any other places people should go to either measure this or better understand it or better utilize it?
Great. Yes. You know, there's something called the Fearless Organization Scan that Infocaster in the Netherlands have posted, and you can go there for free and do your own sort of psychological safety rating. You can have your colleagues do it as well. If you want to do it at scale, they'll help you do that as well. But it's sort of a great way to go and just experiment and learn more about the concept.
Is that Agile group?
No, it's called Infocaster.
Infocaster, okay.
And what they're really good at is measuring things and making measures user friendly, and making the sort of the data that come back to you look compelling and be easy to understand.
Because I think that's important. I think a lot of people, and I'm just thinking of some of the managers' names flashing before me. It's not ill intent. It's just, you know, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know that they're creating an environment which isn't psychologically safe. You know, in their heads, they're thinking, I'm fine, I'm good. So I think it's great to have some way of measuring that quality and seeing what that could be like. So as we move towards wrapping up, how do people learn more? What resources should they turn to?
Well, I do think the book is probably the best source for learning more about this phenomenon. You can always there's a handful of digital articles that I've written out there on specific case studies and some advice and techniques and so forth. Easy to go to my faculty page at the hbs.edu website as well to.
Okay, and then there'll be links there and everything. And you've got a ton of stuff in Harvard Business Review and all those sorts of places. So that's great. Well, my goodness, that flew by. Any kind of parting benedictions, especially for people grappling with feeling so unmoored right now?
Yeah, I don't feel worthy of the benediction level.
All right. Closing comments then.
I want to say with great humility and concern. I don't feel I recognize the importance of psychological safety in the current moment, and I don't feel fully capable of doing it justice, right? And of helping people find it and put it to good use to have the conversations that we so dearly need to have.
Yeah, we really, really do. I had a fascinating incident at work where we've been planning to go forward with a program, and one of our team members, who's a person of color, said, I think this is really tone deaf. This is not a moment to be business as usual. And it kind of stopped everybody in their tracks. And to our credit, people said, thank you. We weren't thinking about it. We didn't know it, and it wasn't ill will. And I think this is the really important thing to emphasize. It was just, it had been in the calendar. We were going to go forward. It was just, nobody thought about, this is not the right moment to be doing this.
Right. And in fact, I think one of the most important things to hang on to is the idea of blind spots. When people are stepping in it by mistake or looking tone deaf and not honoring the moment appropriately, it is not because they don't care. It's likely that they're blind, and so they deserve our help, and that includes me. We all have blind spots. Mm-hmm. That's a given. Mm-hmm. We need to open them, because the more open they are, the more space there is for us to work together.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great place to end. So thank you so much. This has been marvelous, and I'll look forward to connecting again.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you for having this great session.
Thank you. Bye.